He was the best at proving that ancient artifacts were fake. They called him when they wanted the truth. But this time, the truth found him first. A miracle of the Virgin Mary that no one expected. But before we continue, leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. You know that type of person who thinks they know everything? Not in an arrogant way, in a tired way. Like someone who's seen too much to believe in anything anymore. Frank Whaley was that kind of person, 48 years old, an antiques specialist. One of the best when it came to authenticating historical pieces. Museums called him. Wealthy collectors paid fortunes for his opinion. Auction houses waited weeks in line just to have his name on an authentication report. Frank had a trained eye, decades of experience. He could identify a forgery in minutes. He knew how to tell 100-year-old wood from wood treated to look old. He knew the patterns of wear, the marks of time, the signs that only someone who spent a lifetime studying can see. And he was an atheist. Completely. He didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in miracles. To Frank, the world was made of things that could be measured, weighed, analyzed. The rest was fantasy. But Frank didn't do it for the money. He did it because he was good at it. Because he had spent his entire life studying. And also because he had nothing else. You know when someone lets life pass by while being too busy? That was Frank. The marriage had ended 2 years earlier. His wife Diane left on a Tuesday. There was no fight, no shouting. She just said she couldn't take living with someone who was always somewhere else, even when he was right beside her. Frank remembered that day. Diane packed her bags in silence. He was in his office working on a report. When she came downstairs with the last bag, Frank looked at her and didn't know what to say. "You're not even going to ask why," she had said. Frank stayed silent. "That's it," she said. "That silence, that distance. I'm tired of competing with museum pieces, Frank. I'm tired of being less important than an 18th century vase." Frank didn't argue. He didn't ask her to stay. He just nodded and went back to work. And there was his son, Brian, 23 years old, living in another city. The two of them hadn't really spoken in almost a year. Frank told himself it was normal, that children grow up and move on with their lives, that there was nothing wrong. But deep down, he knew. He had chosen work, always. And the worst part is that it wasn't a conscious decision. It happened little by little, one commitment here, one trip there, always thinking there would be time later, that Brian would understand, that family could wait. Family can never wait. Have you ever met someone who doesn't accept help from anyone? Frank was like that too. It was easier to be alone. It was easier to say everything was fine. It was easier to pretend he didn't need anyone. And maybe that was why he hid from everyone what was happening to his body. The cough had started about 3 years earlier. At first, it was just an irritation, a tickle in his throat that wouldn't go away. Frank thought it was an allergy, dust from old artifacts, mold from museum storage rooms, but it got worse. The cough turned into shortness of breath. The shortness of breath turned into exhaustion. The exhaustion turned into something he could no longer hide. Climbing stairs became a problem. 2 flights of steps and Frank had to stop, brace his hand against the wall, wait for the air to come back. Walking fast became impossible. He, who had always rushed through the city, now moved slowly, measuring every step. There was one time in the middle of an important evaluation when Frank had to stop, just stop, sit down in a chair and wait for the air to return to his lungs while 3 people stared at him, not knowing what to do. The silence in the room was worse than the lack of air, the looks of concern, the whispers. "Is Dr. Whaley okay? Should someone call a doctor?" It was humiliating. After that day, he went to the doctor. The test results were not good, a problem with his lungs. Something serious. The doctor used words Frank didn't want to really hear. He talked about treatments that could help, but not cure. He talked about quality of life, about realistic expectations, about numbers and statistics that Frank understood perfectly well, but pretended not to. Frank listened with the same expression he used when evaluating a fake artifact. Distant, analytical, as if it had nothing to do with him. "Do you understand what I said?" the doctor asked. "I understand," Frank replied. "And what do you intend to do?" Frank shrugged. "Keep working as long as I can," he said. The doctor looked at him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "All right. But you need to understand one thing. This isn't going to get better. Not the way things are. You might still have years, or you might have months." "It depends on how you take care of yourself," the doctor explained. Frank said nothing. He didn't tell anyone. Not Diane, who still called from time to time to ask if he was doing okay. Not his co-workers, who wondered why he had been slower, more tired, paler. He kept it to himself the way he kept everything. Alone. And he kept working. Because it was the only thing he knew how to do. The call came on an October Thursday. Frank was in the office, surrounded by papers and half-finished reports. The coughing had been particularly bad that week. He had barely slept the past few nights. The phone rang. "Doctor?" "Whaley, my name is Catherine Price. I own a property that has belonged to my family for generations. We're selling the house and found some items in the basement that we'd like to have evaluated," said the woman on the other end of the line. Frank rubbed his eyes. "What kind of items?" he asked. "Several things. Antique furniture, some paintings, and a statue." "A statue of the Virgin Mary that, according to family records, has been on the property for more than 200 years, Catherine replied. Frank felt a stab of interest. 200 years was long enough to make anything interesting. "Do you have photos?" Frank asked. "I do. I can send them now," she said. 5 minutes later, Frank was staring at his phone. The statue was beautiful, dark wood, probably oak, about 60 centimeters tall. The workmanship was delicate, detailed. The Virgin Mary with her hands in a prayer position, the cloak falling in folds that looked almost real. It could be authentic. It could be a well-made reproduction, impossible to know from a photo alone. "When would you like me to come?" Frank asked. "As soon as possible. We have buyers interested in the house, but we don't want to sell anything without knowing its real value," Catherine replied. Frank looked at the pile of work on his desk, looked at the calendar, looked at his own reflection in the window glass. A 48-year-old man who looked 60. "I can come next week." The Price property was out in the countryside, one of those old houses that looked like they were taken straight out of a movie. 3 stories, tall windows, a garden that must once have been beautiful but was now abandoned. Frank arrived on a Tuesday morning, alone. For an initial evaluation, he didn't need anyone else. The sky was gray. The air had that autumn smell of dry leaves and damp earth. Catherine Price was waiting at the door. A woman around 60, gray hair pulled back into a bun, eyes tired from weeks of sorting through generations of accumulated lives. "Dr. Whaley, thank you for coming," Catherine said. "No problem," Frank replied. She led him inside. The house was exactly what Frank expected. Furniture covered with white sheets, the smell of dust and time, dim light filtering through closed curtains. "Most of the pieces are in the basement, but the statue is in a separate room on the second floor," Catherine explained. Frank nodded. "May I see the statue first?" he asked. "Of course. This way," Catherine said. The room was on the second floor. It was small, with a single window overlooking the back garden. The walls were of faded blue. There was no furniture except for a wooden table in the center. And on top of the table, the statue. Frank stopped at the doorway. You know when you walk into a place and feel that something is different? Not in a bad way, not in a good way, just different. Frank felt it, but he ignored it, because that was what he did, ignore things that didn't make sense. "May I examine it alone?" he asked. Catherine seemed surprised. "Of course, I'll be downstairs if you need anything," she replied. She left. The door closed, and Frank was alone with the statue. He approached slowly. The piece was even more impressive up close. The workmanship in the wood was extraordinary. Every detail of the face, the hands, the folds of the robe, all done with a precision you didn't see in ordinary pieces. Frank took a magnifying glass from his pocket. He began to examine it. The wood was old. That much was obvious. The natural wear, the small cracks, everything suggested at least 2 centuries, perhaps more. He was writing notes in a notebook when it happened. The smell. Frank stopped writing. The pen hovered in the air. Roses. A sweet, intense perfume that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. It wasn't just a smell. It was a presence. As if someone had opened a door to a garden that didn't exist. As if the air itself had changed texture. Frank closed his eyes for a moment. The perfume was so real, so alive, that he could almost see the petals, red, fresh, as if someone had just picked a bouquet and left it there, invisible, in the middle of that empty room. He opened his eyes, looked around. The room was empty. There were no flowers, no vases, nothing that could explain that perfume. Frank stood up from the chair, went to the window, looked down at the garden below. There were no rose bushes, just overgrown weeds and leafless trees. The abandoned garden of a house that was being sold. But the smell was still there. Real. Impossible to ignore. Impossible to explain. Frank stood still, breathing in that air that made no sense, his heart beating a little faster. A strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something else. Something he didn't know how to name. Something between surprise and... what? Reverence? No. Frank didn't feel reverence for anything, but he felt something. After a few minutes, the scent began to grow weaker, little by little, as if it were saying goodbye, until it vanished completely. The room went back to smelling of dust and old wood. Frank stared at the statue for a long moment. The Virgin Mary stared back, with that serene expression artists from centuries ago had carved into the wood. "You're losing it," he muttered to himself. He shook his head, went back to work. But his hands trembled slightly when he picked up the pen again. In the late afternoon, Frank went downstairs to talk to Catherine. "The statue appears to be authentic," he said, "but I need to do a more detailed analysis. I have equipment in my lab in Ohio that I can't bring here. Specialized microscopes, access to databases, colleagues who can help determine the exact origin." Catherine listened attentively. "How long would that take?" she asked. "A few weeks. I'll take care of it, as if it were my own, full insurance, everything documented." "And the value? Do you have any idea yet?" Frank hesitated. "It's still too early to say for sure. But if it's what I think it is, it could be worth far more than you imagine." Catherine nodded. "All right, you can take it. I trust you." Frank thanked her. "You're welcome to stay here tonight if you'd like," Catherine offered. "The trip back is long, and it's already late." Frank looked out the window. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The road to Ohio would take several hours, and he was tired, more tired than he cared to admit. "All right, thank you." That night, Frank slept better than he had in months. The guest room was simple. A single bed, an old wardrobe, a window that looked out onto the back garden. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper, small flowers that had long since lost their color. Frank lay down expecting the usual insomnia, expecting the cough that came every night without fail, expecting to wake up at 3 in the morning, gasping, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn. But none of that happened. He slept. He truly slept. A deep sleep, uninterrupted, without episodes. When he woke up, the morning light was streaming through the window, birds were singing outside, and Frank felt different, rested. He lay there for a moment, trying to understand. When was the last time he had woken up like this? Months ago? A year? Must be the country air, he said to himself as he got dressed. Far from city pollution, good for the lungs. It was a rational explanation, an explanation that made sense. Frank clung to it. Frank packed the statue carefully, layers of foam, a reinforced wooden crate, everything to make sure the piece arrived intact, and went back to Ohio. The statue stayed in Frank's laboratory, a space at the back of his office filled with equipment, magnifying lenses, computers, and artifacts at different stages of analysis. Metal shelves stacked with labeled boxes. A large work table in the center, illuminated by an articulated lamp. That was where he spent most of his time, where he felt at home, and that was where things began to change. On the first day back, Frank noticed that his cough was lighter. It hadn't disappeared. But it was different, less frequent, less intense. He ignored it. It had to be a coincidence. Maybe the rest at the Price's house had helped. On the second day, he climbed the office stairs without stopping halfway. That was strange. Over the past 3 years, there hadn't been a single day without at least one episode. Sometimes there were several. Sometimes he spent long minutes trying to catch his breath, leaning against the wall, waiting for his heart to slow down. But that day, nothing. Frank sat in the laboratory chair and stared at the statue of the Virgin Mary. The light from the window fell across her face, creating soft shadows in the folds of her mantle. Coincidence, he said quietly, just a coincidence. On the third day, Frank woke up feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Energy. It wasn't explosive energy. It wasn't as if he were 20 again. It was more as if the weight he carried on his shoulders had become a little lighter, as if breathing had become a little easier. Do you know how strange that is? For someone who for months hadn't managed to get through a single day without feeling exhausted, Frank knew, and it was starting to bother him because it didn't make any sense at all. David and Michelle, Frank's assistants in the lab, noticed the change. David had worked with him for 5 years. Michelle was a restoration specialist. Both knew Frank well. They knew the cough. They knew the fatigue. They knew the pauses to catch his breath. "Boss, are you okay?" David asked. "You seem different." "I'm great," Frank replied. And for the first time in years, it was true. The two assistants exchanged glances, but said nothing more, not in front of him. Michelle commented later, when they were alone in the storage room organizing other pieces. "Did you see him go up the stairs today? Without stopping, without getting winded. When was the last time that happened?" David shook his head. "A long time ago. A very long time." "What do you think happened?" "I don't know, but something changed after that trip." Michelle looked toward the lab where Frank was working. "Do you think it has anything to do with the statue?" David shrugged. "I don't know. But if it does, I'm not complaining. It's been a long time since I've seen the boss like this." A week later, Frank called the clinic to reschedule an appointment. While he waited for the results, he continued working on the statue. He researched online in international databases. He consulted records of European sacred art. He sent photos to specialist colleagues in different countries. He exchanged emails with an art history professor in Rome who had studied similar pieces. The conclusion was unanimous. The statue was authentic. Approximately 250 years old, probably of European origin, possibly Italian or Spanish. Estimated value, considerable. But it wasn't the value of the statue that occupied Frank's mind. It was something else, a sensation he couldn't explain, something he felt in his chest every time he looked at that wooden image, an urgency, a need to do something. And little by little, he began to understand what it was. Brian. He needed to talk to his son. He didn't know why. Nothing had happened. There was no logical reason, but the feeling was there, present, insistent. Have you ever had that feeling? that you needed to do something and didn't know why? Frank never had. He was a practical man, rational. He didn't make decisions based on vague feelings or intuitions, but that feeling about Brian, it wouldn't go away. It stayed there in the back of his mind, like a song you can't get out of your head. That night, Frank picked up his phone. He looked at his son's name in his contact list. The last call between them had been almost a year earlier, a short, forced conversation, full of uncomfortable silences. Frank had asked how work was going. Brian had said it was fine. And then, nothing. That silence that says more than any words. Frank didn't call. He put the phone away, turned off the light, tried to sleep. But he stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the son he barely knew anymore, thinking about all the times he had said, "We'll talk later," and later never came. The test results arrived. Frank was in the doctor's office, sitting in the same chair where he had received the diagnosis 3 years earlier, the same chair where he had heard that it wouldn't get better, that he might have years or months. And now he was there again, waiting. The doctor looked at the papers, looked at Frank, looked at the papers again. He frowned. "This is unusual," the doctor said. "What?" Frank asked. His heart raced. Unusual could be good or bad. "Your lungs, Dr. Whaley, they are better," the doctor replied. Frank fell silent. Had he heard that right? The doctor kept flipping through the papers, comparing them, slowly shaking his head. "Significantly better. I don't know how to explain it. Based on the previous tests, this shouldn't be possible," he said. "What do you mean by shouldn't be possible?" Frank asked. The doctor took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes. He looked genuinely confused. "I mean that you had a degenerative condition. These conditions don't improve. They stabilize at best. They don't reverse," the doctor explained. "But it reversed," Frank said. "Apparently. The tests show an improvement of almost 60% in lung function. I've never seen anything like this before." "In 30 years of practice, never," the doctor said. Frank looked at the report. "So I'm cured?" Frank asked. The doctor hesitated. "I wouldn't say cured, but better. Much better. If this improvement continues," he shook his head again, "sometimes the body does things we can't explain. Medicine doesn't have all the answers." Frank nodded slowly. "Yeah, sometimes," he replied. But he knew it wasn't sometimes. He knew something was different. Something that had started in that house in the countryside, in that room with the statue of the Virgin Mary. He just didn't know what. He left the office and walked. He had no destination. He just walked. Through the streets he knew so well, through the parks he never had time to visit, along sidewalks full of people who had no idea what was happening to him. The sun was setting. The sky had that late afternoon color, half orange, half pink. And as he walked, he thought about the statue of the Virgin Mary, about the smell of roses he had felt in that room, about the improvement that should not have happened. He thought about all the times he had looked at someone and said with that arrogant certainty, "Miracles don't exist, they're just coincidences." How many times had he done that? How many times had he dismissed other people's faith? He thought about Brian. And at some point, Frank stopped. There was a wooden bench in front of him. An ordinary bench in an ordinary square. He sat down, and for the first time in decades, he admitted the truth. "I don't know what's happening." He said it quietly. To himself, to no one. "I don't know why I'm getting better. I don't know why I can't stop thinking about my son. I don't know anything anymore." Frank sat on that bench for a while. The sun finished setting. The city lights began to turn on one by one, and as he sat there, he thought about everything he had done wrong. About the marriage he had let fall apart. Diane had asked for so little, just attention, just presence, just that he truly be there, not only physically, And Frank couldn't give even that. About the son he had pushed away, Brian had tried, for years, calling, sending messages, inviting him to lunch. And Frank always had an excuse, always had something more important, until Brian got tired of trying. About the people he had pushed away, friends, colleagues, the family he almost never saw. He had spent his entire life believing that work was what mattered, and everything else was a distraction. And now he realized that he didn't know anything, that he had wasted what truly mattered, chasing things that didn't matter that much. That night, Frank called Brian. The phone rang 3 times. Frank almost hung up. What was he going to say? Where would he begin? "Hello," said his son's voice. "Brian, it's your dad," said Frank. Silence on the other end. "Dad? Did something happen?" Brian asked. Frank closed his eyes. "No, I wanted to talk to you," Frank replied. More silence. "Talk about what?" Brian asked. "I don't know. Everything. Nothing. Frank took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, breathing didn't hurt. "I messed up, Brian. I messed up badly. And I know there's no excuse. I know I pushed you aside, but His voice faltered. "I want to try, if you'll let me. I want to try to be a real father." "Even if it's late," Frank said. The silence lasted an eternity. Then Brian's voice, low. "Why now?" he asked. "Because I woke up. Because something woke me up. And I realized I was losing the only thing that really matters," Frank replied. Brian didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Okay," Brian said. "Okay?" Frank asked. "Okay, we can talk. I don't know if it'll work. I don't know if I can forgive everything, but we can try," Brian said. "Thank you," Frank said. "Don't thank me yet, Dad." "We've got a long road ahead," Brian replied. "I know, but we can walk it together," Frank said. Frank and Brian started slowly. Short phone calls, text messages, conversations that were more silence than words, but they were conversations, and that was already more than they'd had in a year. Brian came to visit on a Sunday. Frank was nervous all morning. He cleaned the apartment 3 times. He kept looking out the window, waiting for his son's car to appear. When Brian arrived, the 2 of them stood at the door for a moment, not knowing whether to hug, shake hands, or just wave. In the end, Frank stepped forward and hugged his son. An awkward hug from someone who hadn't done it in a long time, but a hug. "Hi, Dad," Brian said. "Hi, son," Frank replied. It was strange at first. 2 strangers trying to build a bridge over months of distance. They had lunch at an Italian restaurant near Frank's apartment. They talked about small things. Brian's job at a technology company, the weather that had changed in the past few weeks, a movie they had both watched, by coincidence, the same weekend. Little by little, the silences became less uncomfortable. The words began to flow a little more easily. At the end of lunch, Brian looked at his father. "You seem different," Brian said. "Different how?" Frank asked. "I don't know. You seem better, more present, I guess," Brian replied. Frank smiled. A real smile, not the automatic one he used at work. "I am better," he said. Brian looked at him for a moment. There was something in his eyes. It wasn't exactly forgiveness. It was more like hope, maybe. "That's good, Dad. That's very good," Brian said. They sat in silence for a moment. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Thank you for calling. Thank you for trying." Frank felt a knot in his throat. "Thank you for answering," he replied. The statue of the Virgin Mary returned to the Price family. Frank handed over the complete report, explained the value, recommended a trusted auctioneer. Catherine thanked him. She said her grandmother would be happy to know the statue had been in good hands during the appraisal. But before returning it, Frank did one thing. He bought a small image of the Virgin Mary. Simple, nothing special, from a religious goods store downtown. He placed it on a shelf in his office. In the corner, near the window, he didn't tell anyone. He wouldn't be able to explain it even if he tried. It was just an image on a shelf, but every time Frank looked at it, he remembered. He remembered the smell of roses, the room in the countryside, that moment when something had changed inside him. And he was grateful. Even without knowing exactly to whom or for what he was grateful, he was. Was Frank Whaley still an atheist? Maybe. He didn't know anymore. He wasn't sure of anything. But for the first time in his life, he was okay with that. He was okay with not having all the answers. He was okay with accepting that there are things that cannot be measured, weighed, or analyzed. Some things simply happen. And maybe that is enough. Some time later, Frank is in his office working on a new piece, a 19th century bronze clock. Common thing, routine. He works for hours without stopping, without coughing, without needing to sit down to catch his breath. When he finishes, he stands up, stretches his back, takes a deep breath. Taking a deep breath. Such a simple thing. Something most people do without thinking, Frank thinks. He looks at the image of the Virgin Mary on the shelf. Then he picks up his phone. "Hey, Brian, are you free for dinner tomorrow?" Frank asked. "I am, Dad. That Italian restaurant?" Brian replied. "That's the one," Frank said. "All right, see you there," Brian said. Frank hangs up, puts the phone away. His life had changed. He doesn't know how to explain it. He doesn't know why. But it changed, and that is enough. Before we finish, I want to invite you to be part of our prayer community for the Virgin Mary, a space of faith and hope where people from all over the world come together to pray and to share the graces they have received. If you feel in your heart the desire to be part of this chain of prayer, click below and become a member of the channel today, and come pray with us. And look, if you made it all the way here, to the very end of Frank's story, do one thing for me. Write in the comments roses, the scent that should not have existed, but that changed everything. I want to see how many hearts this story has reached. And every time I read that word in the comments, I will know that one more person believes that the miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Write in the comments about a miracle you have already witnessed or experienced, and share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.